I'm sure we'll have more people trickle in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and good morning to our friends on Pacific time. Ramadan Kareem to our friends and colleagues in the midst of observation. My name is Stephen Leach. I am a security fellow with Truman National Security Project's Colorado chapter. Today's panel will discuss the security threat posed by white nationalist violence and the challenge of responding to it. We'll talk about the changing landscape, the recent history of US response to domestic threats, real and perceived, and how we should consider response moving forward. Joining us today is Representative Alyssa Slotkin. Congresswoman Slotkin represents Michigan's 8th Congressional District and previously worked for the CIA alongside the US military as an analyst in Iraq. Earlier this year, after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, Representative Slotkin became chair of the House Homeland Security Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism. Welcome, Representative Slotkin.
Thanks for having me.
Also joining us today is Stephen Gardner, Assistant Research Director at Political Research Associates. Political Research Associates has for 4 decades researched, analyzed, and reported the rise of right-wing extremism. A military veteran based in Louisville, Stephen Gardner has written and taught on far-right movements, toxic masculinities, and the religious foundations of right-wing extremism, among other topics. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here.
And our third panelist is Fatima Ahmad. Fatima is Executive Director at Muslim Justice League, where she leads the organization's efforts to identify and oppose programs to counter violent extremism that surveil and target marginalized communities under the pretext of national security. In addition to leading the National Stop CVE network, Fatima and MJL have organized local coalitions to empower communities targeted by CVE programs. Welcome, Fatima.
Thanks for having me.
Our panelists have agreed to a discussion format and know that we're gonna do our best to stay on track and engage one another. And of course, welcome and thank you, all those who are joining us. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask questions. I will interweave some of these questions into the initial discussion, and we will shift for the final 10 to 15 minutes of the hour to focus directly on questions from the audience. I want to call your attention to a post-event survey. The challenges posed by white supremacist and right-wing violence are multifaceted, and one of the questions asks for your input about future events. So please take a few moments when that arrives in your inbox. To set the foundation for our conversation, I would like to turn to Representative Slotkin. When you took chair of the House Subcommittee, you said that the nature of internal ideologically motivated violence differs from that of the external threat. What are some of the key differences between the international security concerns that have held our attention for the past 20 years and the domestic security concerns that have always been present but have significantly escalated over the past decade?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me. I mean, I think, as someone who watched the external threats for basically my entire career, 15 years in the executive branch, there are a lot of differences. I think first and foremost, particularly being from mid-Michigan, where we've had a pretty significant share of violent extremism, plots to assassinate, kidnap and assassinate my governor, armed protesters pushing their way into our state capitol. The fundamental difference is that the people we're talking about are our neighbors. They're, community members, they're in our schools, they're in our churches, they are woven into the fabric of our communities. And because of the protections that we all believe in for, granted by the Constitution, the tools to go after folks who are espousing some of this violent extremism are just fundamentally different from some of the tools that we have if we're talking about a group like Al-Qaeda who's emanating from a place like Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. And the legal basis to go after folks is very, very different. And so, for that reason, and because basically since Watergate, the executive branch has been hypersensitive about the perception that they're going after American citizens. It means that everything we do is under a microscope, that we have to be much more mindful than, frankly, they were in the war on terror if you want to deal with this threat. It doesn't, absolve us of our responsibility to do something, because I can tell you from my own community, there is real, violence and felonies being perpetrated in the name of sort of ideology, particularly white supremacy. But it does mean that our whole approach has to be fundamentally different than when we think about a foreign terrorist organization abroad. And it's that balance that we're trying to get right. And we had 20 years of, the post 9/11 era, where we have some important lessons, both good and bad, to learn from as we kind of go forward on the domestic terrorism threat.
Thank you. Stephen, you've been studying this for quite a long time, paying more attention than most people. What's the current scale of organized white supremacist activity, and what do you understand to be some of the underlying causes?
Yeah, sure. First, not to get too hung up on terminology, but from our point of view, we talk about white nationalism as a spectrum, and we say white nationalism not to avoid saying white supremacy, but we see the system under which the United States operates as a kind of colorblind systemic white supremacy. If you want to think of that in statistical terms of the way justice is organized or unorganized in this country. So that's point one. So we say white nationalists as a social movement that runs a spectrum from violent revolutionaries who think that the current government is any current government, whether that's Democrat or Republican, is irredeemable and has to be destroyed and overthrown, and the society completely recreated and purged of people who are not white enough, to people who are basically just being driven by fear and anxiety about changing composition of the country. So when we talk about scale of the movement, there are different factors involved here. The numbers are hard to come by. You can estimate through a variety of different ways that open white nationalists in this country, people who would say, yeah, I'm a white nationalist, I want to have an exclusively white country, not a country that is led by white people or that is dominated by white people, but a country that is demographically all white or effectively so. You're talking about 150, 160 groups maybe scattered across the country. How many people in those groups? It's hard to say, probably 10 to 15,000 people. This is about 3 times as big as it was in the year 2000. Okay, so we've seen steady growth, particularly through the Obama years in reaction to the election of the first Black president, and then through the Trump years as well. Militia and paramilitary groups who largely don't describe themselves as being openly white nationalist, even though they may have feelings about immigration. And from our analytical point of view, we would describe them as being allied to white nationalism. It's a similar size of people who are actively involved, who actually show up in real life, as opposed to sign onto a Facebook group. Proud Boys, again, this is a similar size, up to maybe 20,000 at their peak. But then you start getting into this much larger universe of people who say have strong sympathy for the QAnon conspiracy theory. Now we're up around 4 to 5 million people. People who think that the election, the previous election, was not possibly stolen. That's by the way a normal reaction from the losing side, the side that loses in any election, but that it was definitely stolen, and that it was stolen intentionally and through a plan. That's 18 to 25 million, about 18 million voters, 25 million Americans, adults. And then if you look at the core support for ideas around the United States being replaced, white Americans being replaced, some version of the Great Replacement, that theory that we now see, Tucker Carlson talking about, that we've seen Ted Cruz talk about. Now you're talking 30 to 40 million people who have some fear that underlying identity resentment organized around race and ethnicity and belonging, all of which has to do with defining who is the we. So that's kind of the basic scale of this. And I'm always a little nervous about making an absolute distinction between those who are immediately prone to or may turn soon towards violence, and those are sort of in this larger group. Not because I want to condemn the larger group, but because if we think only about the part that can be dealt with through law enforcement, we actually miss the more significant problem of culture and politics.
Yeah, Representative Slotkin, in talking to your team, that there was a similar framing of there's kind of this security concern, and then there's this long tail that probably requires, there's some degree to which there needs to be interdiction by law enforcement for imminent threats of violence. But then there's this whole broad category that's going to require a cultural shift. And I wondered if you could speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, the most effective imagery that I use is like the pyramid of hate, right? Which is actually from Holocaust education. And it's like down at the base of the pyramid, it's a huge wide swath of people who maybe have certain views, have certain, they feel a sense of grievance. They feel like there's a loss of their role in society. They feel like they need someone to scapegoat or blame. And you sort of move your way up the pyramid, this ladder of escalation that goes on, frankly, that I used to see looking at how people mobilize as terrorists abroad, where you go from posting on social media and being frustrated and kind of talking about this stuff to actually carrying out acts of discrimination, and then all the way up the chain to potential violence. It is very, very difficult, especially because of our civil liberties. We don't go after people who are just expressing their views, who are at the bottom of the pyramid. We may find it completely distasteful, but they have the right to express their views, just like anybody does. But then figuring out who is going to climb that ladder, who's going to move up that pyramid and actually commit crimes and incite and use violence, it's just a very hard thing for law enforcement, for the FBI to figure out. And in the plot that we had here in my district, in my state, to kidnap and assassinate the governor, we got incredibly lucky that the FBI had not one but two paid informants in the circle of trust who were literally recording these guys. That's rare. That's very rare. So, but I think that bottom level of the pyramid, the use of misinformation and disinformation to influence that group is profound, especially now. And for me, that's where I do have the ability, or should have the ability as a legislator, to go at the problem, right? It shouldn't be totally okay to espouse misinformation and disinformation on TV, on social media. Like, I have a problem with that, with intentionally misleading people. And I think that's, as a legislator, where I focus my attention, rather than on the people who have the right to express even really horrible views.
Yeah, and you make an important point there in highlighting how rare it is. And there's actually a discrepancy between, there's a report that came out earlier this week that Islamist plans for violence in the US have been disrupted at the planning stage. Like 2/3 have been disrupted at the planning stage, and almost a quarter of right-wing violence has been disrupted at the planning stage. So there's a big discrepancy in the way that law enforcement has gone after it. But we've also seen, I think, over the last 20 years, and particularly even over the last 10 years, that these same groups that are often targeted by right-wing extremists, it's women of color, Muslims, the Sikh community, other minorities and migrants. They've been targeted by white supremacist violence, but then they've also often been victimized a second time by surveillance and aggressive activities. First, the global war on terror, then CVE, then PVE. Now we have DVE and TVTP. And so I thought maybe Fatima could speak to some of the challenges that these particular programs and their constructs, the foundations behind them, have posed.
Yes, I would love to. Yeah, there's too many acronyms. So I will say, the words to look out for are extremism. That tends to be the one, whether it's domestic violent extremism, racially motivated violent extremism, countering violent extremism. That framing that there are people who are extreme in some way, in and of itself, is like not based in anything concrete. So what you'll see in these programs and this framework, this CVE framework, as we like to call it, is this kind of language like extremism, radicalization, terrorism, that is actually pretty vague. And I say this as someone who was previously an engineer and scientist. And so I'm like, pretty serious about being accurate with how we think about, these systems and how we think about solutions. What you'll find with those terms, and I think many people witness this with the January 6th attack, is that they're clearly not used in the same way about very similar incidents, right? They're clearly used more frequently with people of color, Muslims in particular. And that is just historically true. You can look back to the very early days of the FBI when they called Black Muslims fanatics of racial equality for standing up for their rights, for talking about white supremacy. And you see that continued through COINTELPRO and the civil rights movement. And then that gets cited, in recent years when the FBI talks about quote unquote Black identity extremism. And now they've switched to calling it racially motivated violent extremism to, supposedly encompass both sides. But one key thing here is when we're thinking about white supremacy, there's not two extreme sides, right? We're talking about white supremacy and racial justice. And what this framework does is actually equating folks who are standing up for their rights, who are speaking out against white supremacy, with people who are either, explicitly white nationalists, as Stephen said, or just, in some way on the spectrum of white supremacy. The other really essential thing to know is that there's no science or numbers or data to actually back any of this up. So this theory of radicalization, so many people will cite this without understanding that, it came out of this very Islamophobic idea and a counterinsurgency strategy that has been debunked time and time again. And even people who participate in CVE and who run these programs are continuously saying that they're not able to evaluate CVE and its effectiveness. There's nothing to back up that it is actually working, because it's based in this idea that, you're assuming that someone is going to commit violence, right? Like Representative Slotkin talked about this escalator or ladder idea. If you pose that to people, take me and Stephen Gardner, for example, who, he mentioned that he has spent some time living in the Middle East. And I'm guessing that Stephen does not get stopped and harassed at TSA and every airport in the way that I do, even though I haven't lived in the Middle East, but have just, traveled there to visit my family, and, was held and almost missed a flight because I was potentially a Syrian refugee faking an American passport, according to the American agent who was in this airport. We know that these things are not used equally against white folks and people of color and Muslim folks, right? And so when we buy into this rhetoric that, again, has no scientific backing, and it also seems like a nice community policing type of way to go about this, right? These CVE frameworks are all about supporting mental health, supposedly, and supporting youth. But you're actually saying that our youth are prone to becoming terrorists, which again is inherently Islamophobic, inherently racist. You're actually just furthering cultural white supremacy, right? We know that those funds are going to go towards targeting people of color. We know how this plays out in schools because we can already see, the school to deportation and school to prison pipeline that affects youth of color. And so this framework actually is just adding to white supremacy rather than addressing
it. In terms of my own experience and work, I've used to do quite a bit of work in East Africa and live in sub-Saharan Africa. And there was a program that I observed in 2013 that was US funded and built community centers for young men and viewed them as entrepreneurs and future pillars of their community. But then with the arrival of CVE funding, people put the same program, the exact same structure under CVE funding. And there's an important shift in the framework there where these young men have gone from potential to potential resources, potential pillars of their community to now being viewed at least at an evaluative level in the valuations to validate the funding as potential security threats. And so there does seem to be an important aspect of language here. I was wondering if Representative Slotkin, if you had any thoughts on what is gained and what is still maybe missing the mark by this shift to domestic violent extremism and TVTP, targeted violence and terrorism prevention, because it seems like we're creating new acronyms for very similar things without resolving significant issues.
Yeah, I can't speak to the acronyms. I mean, what I will say, I think there's some things I agreed with Fatima and some things I didn't. I think the important thing, I mean, just 2 weeks ago, I wrote to the Secretary of State asking him to consider designating a bunch of foreign white supremacist organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, an official FTO, right? Another acronym. And we know from the way our legal system works that if a foreign organization is labeled an FTO, then it opens up more opportunities for those who may be providing material support for those groups. So we know that there are people, including in my own state, who are reaching out to these groups in Eastern Ukraine and other parts of Europe. They're sharing tactics. Some of them are traveling from the United States to go get trained and fight alongside these groups for their agenda. They're sharing resources. There is some evidence that there's some money going back and forth. So to me, I'm interested in if the issue is balancing the scales and making sure we have as much visibility on the groups that are violent white nationalists or white extremists, then we need that additional hook that legal authority would give us. So we'll see. The Secretary of State says he's going to look at it and take a look and put it through the gonculator and see if they meet the threshold for what a foreign terrorist organization is. But I think that that's important in terms of balancing the scales. And I think that, the truth is it's a struggle. I mean, I will tell you that I've spent the last couple of weeks calling pastors in my district, calling city officials, stiffening their spine and empathizing with them because they've been Zoom bombed. by people purporting to be members of the KKK, putting up pictures of people giving the Nazi salute and saying horrible things to the pastors and to the city officials, to the point where they just shut down the Zoom, right? Like it just collapses a government meeting. It collapses a church service. So I guess the question is, what do you do when you have communities that have a rampant white supremacy problem, or a rampant problem with people who are inciting violence? And I can tell you, as you know, the person that people call when they're under attack, they would sure like to know that people are thinking about them and trying to deal with this problem. And there is no way that anyone can say over the past 20 years we have a good methodology on this stuff. I mean, I think the evidence is, as Fatima said, scant at best at organizations that have figured out how to do, I don't know what to call it, de-radicalization. I don't know, that I just don't think that we have a good model. But I also know that people feel terrorized in their own communities. So something has to be looked at. And I know that the head of Homeland Security has announced at least an intent to put money towards this problem without much evidence of programs that work or scalability. We have like little programs here and there on this issue that have, I guess, done okay. It's a challenge because we don't have great models, but we also can't ignore the problem for people who feel terrorized.
Yeah, if I can jump in, Stephen, since I'm the person on here who is a person of color and pretty, particularly impacted by white supremacy. So the fun thing to know about me is that I grew up in a small town in Appalachia that had active KKK, and I grew up with folks who became neo-Nazis, who, played with me and my brother when we were younger, and then got swastika tattoos, and 9/11 happened when I was in high school. And so I experienced so much of that violence up front, and really, really personal for me. I also, happened to be from the town that Lindy England is from, and that the other folks who committed the atrocities at Abu Ghraib are from. And so I've seen the violence of white supremacy in so many ways when I was growing up, and still deal with that. I get Zoom bombed on panels like this, and brought it up to Stephen that I would be concerned about white supremacists or white nationalists Zoom bombing us on this. And I know that none of these things that we're talking about, like you said, we don't have a model that works, but we're also not looking at the things that we know work. We know that actually funding what communities need is life affirming, and that reduces violence. And you can see that in different ways. So I don't live in that place anymore. I don't live in Appalachia. I couldn't really thrive in an environment like that. I now live in Boston, which is a pretty big city, has a lot of diversity. The CVE program that happened here, that's now ended, that was targeting Somali youth, literally in its application, they said that 90% of the Somali community in Boston was living in public or subsidized housing. But then the program went on to say, we're going to spend $500,000 to have police officers engage Somali youth instead of just putting that money towards housing, right? The thing that people need, right? And then I have to hear from these youth, these Black Muslim immigrant youth, why can't we have funding for a community center where we can play soccer and basketball? Why is this only coming to us because we're seen as ticking time bombs? But then the other end of that is that the, predominantly white kids I grew up with also felt like, well, I can't stay in my hometown. There's literally no jobs and there's no opportunities. We're getting a second prison in our hometown. So I guess my option is to work at the prison or join the military. so that I can potentially, have some support for my education, or get out of this town, or have, a paying job. And we were, the poorest county in Maryland. We didn't have many resources at our schools. These are all things, when we talk about actually putting resources away from systems of violence, away from surveillance and policing, towards building care, right? And building life affirming support, building really strong communities. We know that that really does reduce violence, and it would actually lift up everyone, right? And lift up all of these communities that are impacted by white supremacy in these different ways.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because this is kind of where we've got this phrase, countering violent extremism, that seems like an implicit good. Who does not want to counter violent extremism? We would all like to live in a world without violent extremism, whatever that may be, because it sounds bad, and probably is bad. However, it ends up being defined, and yet we are faced with this reality that we have scant, or in most cases, the evidence people hold up is anecdotal. Stephen, I think you and I had a conversation where we talked about some of the underlying causes, and we looked at, or you talked about rather, the way that the anti-government inclinations of right-wing extremism really fits into almost a self-fulfilling cycle against some of the solutions that Fatima has just mentioned, and that might be actual ways of preventing violent extremism. I wondered if you would speak to that.
If I take your meaning, yeah, I mean, there is a historic problem of equity about who is targeted, but there's also a logical problem that comes back to it being the same thing of if we're going to learn a lesson from the last 20 years of the quote unquote war on terror. One of the lessons should be that bombing someone's grandmother isn't likely to reduce the net amount of hostility towards you in the world. Likewise, all but the lightest touch of targeted law enforcement because of people's political beliefs is, and you know, I spend my life fighting the far right, fighting fascists, fighting Nazis. I don't like these people, but if we're going to prevent the further delegitimation of our democratic systems, we can't do that through politicized policing. We have to sort of depoliticize it. Now, it is a problem that during some recent administrations, the Justice Department was basically, don't worry about white supremacists, white nationalists. That is a problem. But that said, I don't think anyone is saying if you know, if there's a direct threat to the governor of Michigan that the FBI shouldn't do its job. They should. Okay, that's that. But in terms of what is driving the particular moment that we're in is a crisis of our institutions. And some of those are driven by real factors that have to be worked out much more broadly than in a security framework, than a framework around law enforcement or surveillance or the security state or however you want to talk about it. There's just not a magic bullet there. And in fact, lots of things would be counterproductive. So three of the things that drive this from our perspective are, we're entering a moment of rapid demographic change, or we're living through one in this country. This is real. How it is interpreted, though, is a matter of politics and culture. There are an increasing number of political entrepreneurs, both in media and in formal politics, who have discovered that they can attract a large and dedicated following by playing to fears about the ways in which those changing demographics are going to impact white people. and trying to basically make people afraid. This is a recipe for what is sometimes called scripted violence. When you have people stand up there and say the kinds of things that the previous president said, and that some members of Congress and the Senate are still saying, this is a way to sort of authorize violence. But if we focus only on the violence, we're missing the fact that, in fact, we do have to find ways, if we're going to incorporate large numbers of newcomers, to do it humanely. And that's not going to be possible if our social safety net, if our basic institutions have been so eroded by decades of attack on the very idea of the public good, that even government service itself is starting to seem to many in social movements left and right as being sort of an elitist exercise in maintaining a corrupt status quo. And that's not the way I look at it. I'm saying this is the social movement logic. A second thing is our culture is also changing very quickly. Norms, for example, around gender and sexuality are changing in very dramatic ways. Inequality, economic inequality, is more profound than it has been since the Gilded Age. And then we also have a technological change where those political entrepreneurs can much more rapidly escape the tiny bubble of a microculture and break out into wider influence. I agree with Rep. Slotkin about the need to have a serious discussion about is it really free speech just to troll the world and make up your own facts? Is that protected by the First Amendment? I have my doubts there, especially when the platforms for doing that are private, and private entities always have a right to censor what speech goes on their platforms. So the changes that we're looking at are real. Our institutions have become, frankly, less attractive, at least in terms of how people are responding to them. By our institutions, by the way, I mean government. I mean higher education. I mean participation in the formal economy. I mean all of these things that in the United States we often took for granted as these being like these shining exemplars to the world. And there's increasingly doubt out there and people feeling excluded, even those who were not traditionally excluded. And I mean this racially. I mean, this was not a problem that was invisible to Black folk or Indigenous folk, but white folk are feeling the pinch. And to sort of put the nail on why it's not just a question of equity. Some of you may have seen the quote unquote good news around federal sentencing. Recently it came out that the discrepancies based on race have drastically reduced in the last decade. Good news, except for when you read the fine print, in fact, half of the change has come from increased sentencing of white people as compared to Black people, largely because of the opioid crisis. How is this helping anyone? This is like a morally bankrupt version of equity, as opposed to how do we make our system both more just in racial terms and less brutal, more attentive to the real needs of human beings.
So we've got a bunch of good questions coming in. I did want to loop back and maybe give Congresswoman Slotkin an opportunity to engage, and I'm particularly, this was something that was kind of running through a lot of what Stephen just said, and that I was reading earlier today, that you cannot just destroy a community and expect it to disappear when it is load bearing. And it's this idea that there's something about these groups that they're trying to account for bearing a certain load that maybe they feel like the government hasn't provided, or whatever the case may be, because there's so much change happening. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think some groups may feel a sense of grievance because they don't have what they think they need from their government. Other groups are rabidly anti-government on principle. right? Of just like anything that tells me what I can and cannot do. I mean, this is like the whole sovereign citizen movement out in Nevada, right? That I can occupy public lands, that I reject sort of the role of the government. So I think there's a lot of different flavors on these groups. I do think that there is something there about a community who feels like it needs defending, a community that feels like they have a sense of grievance, and they sort of support a group pushing back on their behalf. And I think that there's also a sense of community that people get from some of these groups. I mean, you can walk into my town right now and see people wearing Proud Boys jackets and bracelets, and like it's a sense of community that they're missing, maybe because of the way our society sort of has become more isolated. I don't know. What I do know is that I think in my experience, like when you're responsible for people's safety and for doing something in response, you have to sort of decide when you're going to get engaged. And for me, the safest thing to do is to look at folks who incite or use violence. There actually is a definition of terrorism, right? It's the use of violence for your political goals. And for me, I don't care who you are. If you are threatening or using violence, then in my mind, we're in a different category. It's no longer free speech. You've given up your First Amendment rights if you're using or threatening violence. And that is what I have to work with when I look at these groups. So even though there may be interesting reasons why they are as successful or as prominent as they are, maybe they are feeling like, my state isn't providing what I need. And that grievance is real, right? For many people, they really believe it and feel it, and it may honest to God be true. It doesn't give them the right to threaten and use violence. So that is what I have to work with when you're in a position of responsibility to be responsive to a community.
There are a whole lot of interesting and thought-provoking questions, and I guess we're going to try to move through them quickly, or sit with the ones that we need to sit with, as the case may be. Here's a kind of general one that I think is really interesting, because there's been a lot of shift in policy and in research toward domestic violent extremism and white supremacy, and outside of the policy and research community, what can the average American do about this problem in their own neighborhood and community? So anybody who wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I would love to take that. I think, one thing to know about this increased research into white supremacy is, again, I think a lot of that is framing that is not backed up by numbers. So you can see, whether it was under the Obama administration or under the Trump administration, that all of the CVE programming, including the research grants, still predominantly focused on Muslims and people of color. Whether now there will be a real shift towards, putting funding towards actually understanding white supremacy is to be seen. But what we've seen in the current grant program is nothing has changed, right? It's the same language. And we'll see, who ends up applying. I think for everyone, though, and this gets to some of the other questions about, regulating disinformation, talking about how social media plays into this, right? We can see, again, across the board, that it's people of color who get targeted by these policies, right? Facebook is much quicker to, ban a Black person for talking about their actual experiences with white supremacy versus banning folks who are explicitly talking about white supremacist violence. That is going to continue until we address the root problem, right? The thing that is across the board that is similar in all of this is white supremacy. And so culturally, we need to tackle that, right? You all have to have conversations with your community members. As Representative Slotkin said, so much of this is based on our communities, right? And what we are and are not talking about. And I know that in the place that I grew up, everyone loved me. I was president of student government. I was all of the things, and everyone in my town knew me and loved me. And they're still very racist, and they still supported the Muslim ban. They still supported things that actually severely impacted me, because that language of love and hate, that's not what it is, right? We're talking about a systemic thing. And when everything they saw on TV and heard from elected officials, pointed to Muslims are violent, they just saw me as an exception, right? They continued to believe all of these Islamophobic things that have just been more deeply entrenched over the past 20 years. So we need to have those conversations, right? In our churches, mosques, and synagogues. We need to have those conversations in schools and really explicitly talk about white supremacy. So when I say, don't use these terms like extremism and radicalization, it obscures what we're up against, right? We need to explicitly call out white supremacy and speak up for racial justice to actually address it.
Thank you, Fatima. We have a series of questions, and it's not really surprising, but they're probably oriented to you, Representative Slotkin. Questions about how, so acknowledging that the path from being curious to storming the Capitol has gotten much shorter as a result of online, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or all these other apps for disinformation. And there are a couple of questions about how to respond to that in a way that does respect rights and rights of brown people and white people, Muslims and white nationalists who are expressing ideas that we may not like but are not moving violently at that time. And there's the specific question is, are there moderate legislators who may be interested in regulating tech platforms or finding ways to curtail the way that this extremism foments?
Yeah, I think, it was interesting when I was on the Homeland Security Committee starting 2 years ago, we brought in all the tech folks. In our committee, it's like usually the number 3 at Facebook, the number 3 at Twitter, right? Not the Mark Zuckerbergs who you've all seen on TV. While this is still a relatively new industry, they really made, from what I could tell, almost no effort to coordinate amongst themselves and process through how their platforms were being used by people spreading misinformation and disinformation, and kind of were like, not my problem, not my fault, not my issue that I can work on. And so, they sort of scoffed, as I sort of understand it, at the flip phone generation in Congress being involved at all in what they, should and should not be doing. Fast forward to January 6th, and I think after January 6th, the tables may have turned and it went the other direction completely. And a ton of accounts that maybe weren't saying nice things, but were probably not meeting the threshold, were shut down, right? Including a lot of my constituents. Before January 6th, I think you could say at best, they were ignoring the problem, and at worst they were monetizing the spread of misinformation and disinformation because it's clickbait and they were able to make money off of it. So I do think that we've kind of hit a point where they are inviting regulation, and there's a ton of support. Frankly, you would be amazed how many Republicans, I think, also from a very different point of view, want to do something about the social media companies. And I think law is important because I bet if I looked at the 79 participants, if I could see them on the 79 participants and ask them, like, raise your hand if you've ever been scrolling on social media, any of your personal accounts, and you just like happen to mistakenly crawl across a bunch of child porn. Most of us have never accidentally waded into child porn. And that is because there is a law that these companies will have to deal with if they actually allow the spread of child porn on their sites. There's no such law, obviously, about misinformation, disinformation, a whole bunch of other categories. So I do think that we're moving steadily towards some sort of regulation of this industry because they seem incapable of self-organizing for the greater good.
Thank you. There's a question. One of the audience members points out that a recent analysis found that one of the richest counties in the country is a source of significant white supremacy, white nationalism. And so when we think about drivers, purported drivers, they obviously extend beyond economic. And so maybe Representative Slotkin and maybe Stephen has some thoughts on that, on those drivers and whether there are ways to address them, since it's not just, and this is something that we know in the international development community, that you can't just throw money at this problem, that there are problems with governance, problems with security, other forms of insecurity beyond economic.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly and then hand it over to Stephen that this is why we just can't take a one size fits all. It may be that there are communities where depravity and lack of access to services and support is what's driving people to become more interested in militia groups or kind of anti-government groups, but not in my area. I mean, not in the area that I represent. I represent some wealthier communities. And when I got on the plane to go to Washington ahead of January 6th, I fly back and forth all the time. You could not buy a ticket from the state of Michigan right or before the attack because of all the people going. And when I walked in, the entire first class was full, and it was full of lovely people who looked like first class passengers, like lovely ladies in their pearls and everything. And they all had matching Q hats on, right? It was like terrifying. So these are not people who are depraved and deprived of some financial access. There is a sense of grievance that the America that they grew up with is somehow no longer their America. And I just think it's important that it's not a one size fits all for every community when it comes to how people radicalize.
I mean, I certainly agree that there are a whole bunch of factors. The research, and this is research that goes back decades, shows that in fact that people who are attracted to the more attracted to political violence in the white nationalist vein, or who simply may not have any attraction to violence, but who have a strong feeling of grievance. It's not because they are personally feeling materially challenged. It's not deprivation. It's that they resent, and that mobilization, that resentment has been mobilized, that their tax dollars may have to go to pay for people who don't look like them. They don't want to pay for brown people to go to school. They don't even want to pay for roads that Black people might want to drive on. So keep those people in the inner city where they don't have to deal with them. And they don't necessarily, not necessarily people who use racist slurs in their daily life. They are just making decisions based on what they see as the collective interest as part of their identity. So this is a question of identity. It is linked to economics, but not because they're afraid that their particular job is being taken by an immigrant. In fact, many of those people are the same people who, want to keep immigrants out except for their gardener, or whatever it is. And that's a stereotype, but nonetheless, it's all kinds of different things there. Those drivers, though, I mean, back to what Fatima was saying, it's like, yes, nonetheless, and this actually relates to something that Rep. Slotkin said too about there being many people who are sort of anti-government. That anti-government ideology is part of what is driving the mistrust of our institutions. No, we can't deal with that with cops or surveillance or the FBI. That is the point. That there are certain, I mean, admitting the limits of actuality on what you can do with security forces, the same way we have to admit it, however belatedly, with what you can do with the American military, no matter how powerful it is, say in Afghanistan. You know, it's not that we want to do nothing. I totally get if someone is calling you and you're in a responsible position, you can't say, oh, well, wait for, you know, material conditions to change in the world. You have to be willing to respond, but we don't need a new political initiative or new acronyms or new programs to do that, is what I'm saying. The FBI, the state police in Michigan are going to respond to the governor is about to be kidnapped regardless, or they should be. If they're responding more slowly because it's people they're less afraid of because they're white, that is a problem. But
I just would say the state of Michigan has one human being who covers hate crimes, one person that is directly connected to resources that are available through the Department of Homeland Security. And it is literally my job to make sure that my attorney general, who is begging for these resources, gets them. That is more resources, more money from this political moment, and I'm going to capitalize on it. I'm going to get it for my state because that one wonderful woman can't handle all the stuff that we're seeing. So I just want to flag that sometimes you need resources in order to do the right thing.
I hear you, and I'm just going to push back with this, that what seems right and good at this moment under a Biden presidency, how are we going to feel about having increased those resources for surveillance, infiltration, when we're dealing with another Trump-esque presidency, another president who has authoritarian tendencies? I mean, I think we need to keep a real close eye on Fourth Amendment issues here.
Agreed.
Very quickly.
I can jump in with just two concrete things, because I think hate crimes, like that is something that a lot of folks are thinking about. And unfortunately, communities of color don't report these because all of that is within law enforcement. It's within the same, you know, people who are targeting us in other ways. So I think that one, like, yes, we want to actually, you know, get resources towards things that communities of color want, right? Which I think many communities of color are saying these things, certain things need to be moved out of institutions of law enforcement, period. Or people are figuring it out on their own and doing their own community-based research to figure it out, because the hate crimes reporting has been so insufficient. And on the material change too, and what folks are talking about, like, yes, like, yeah, it's women in pearls, right? that are part of this. And what we're seeing, and I hope people look into this, is, you know, it's not just about these individuals, right? It's who's mobilizing them. As both Stephen and Representative Slotkin have talked about, there's so much disinformation. There's the incitement piece. And there's this really fantastic report that shows that a lot of funding that is supposedly charitable goes to right-wing institutions that espouse especially anti-LGBTQ and anti-Muslim views, but generally like anti-immigrant, anti-Black, white supremacist groups that sadly get nonprofit status from the IRS and then are able to get millions of dollars of charitable donations from folks with wealth. That's a growing issue that I think a lot of the nonprofit sector is looking into.
I know the Congresswoman has to move along, and I know that a lot of our audience has to as well. I want to quickly say thank you to each of you, to Congresswoman Slotkin, to Fatima, to Stephen, for your engagement on this panel. We had a bunch of good questions. We didn't get to even a third of them. And And I just want to highlight again that post survey, because there is a question about continued programming, because this is clearly a conversation that is going to beg more than an hour, and definitely more than we have given it today. So thank you all for your time and for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody have a great weekend.